Hey, what's up? I'm Fernando, and I'm gonna show you Doodle Studio 95, sort of an in-depth look at what each feature does. When you first get Doodle Studio, you import it into a new project, and then you can open the main window via the window menu, Doodle Studio 95, and you get the big drawing window. I like to dock it to my editor, and yeah, so the basics of it are you have a canvas you can draw on, and you have all these different options that are sort of common with other animation tools. Um, but yeah, I wanted to show you sort of go through each one and see what they do or what they're useful for. Um, you can start with the new button. Will give you sort of all the presets. The idea for Doodle Studio was that you wouldn't have to worry about, um, you know, choosing the right resolution for your drawing or dealing with file formats or anything like that, so that you could just hit new and just start drawing right away. So the new window gives you all these presets that are basically just aspect ratios and resolutions picked out for you. Um, you have a tall animation for that's good for characters, a wide animation, square, a UI frame that when the what UI frame is special because when you click it, you get a border, a sprite border that's gonna be used when you turn this into a UI element. And then a playing card is sort of like a fun little diagonal symmetry where you can make, you know, sort of that typical playing cards where the number on one side is going to be reflected on the other and stuff like that. So you can make like a two of hearts, and like a little guy. I don't know, that's touching its finger. Um, the new window has this sort of this quality setting that goes from chunky to smooth. So chunky is basically going to use point filtering. It's going to be a very low resolution image, so drawing is actually be going to be kind of faster, um, and it gives you these sort of hard edges on all the strokes. And I think it looks really great when you know um, you make drawings that aren't necessarily like beautiful smooth strokes, that they're kind of like dirty and chunky. So I think that's a really good style, and it just happens to be faster for the computer to render. um, and yeah, in the new window you also have the custom button where you can actually just make your own resolution. And yeah, and then when it comes to the tools, you have three basic ones are draw, erase, and the paint bucket. And when you choose each one, you get different options for each one in this area. Um, Draw is just your typical brush. You can choose a different size. There's some key shortcuts for choosing the size. I think with the 1, 2, 3, and 4 and 5 keys. Ink brush will um, change the radius of your brush depending on the velocity with which you're drawing. So it's sort of trying to simulate, um, ink, an ink brush on a paper. It's kind of funky, doesn't quite work very well with all of the different sizes, but it adds some variation. Um, and then the other option is only paint behind, which is really useful when you want to add color to a drawing with a bunch of strokes. So if we have this guy and then we want to add, color to it, we can either use the paint bucket or try and draw around it. But then what only paint behind does is that it's going to ignore any strokes or any pixels that are opaque. So if I draw directly on it, the strokes are going to stay. And this works really well to sort of add color behind strokes. And even if you sort of like get this border outside of the stroke, it actually looks kind of good especially when you have it animated. Um, then erase doesn't have any options. You just choose different sizes for it. The paint bucket is pretty straightforward, but it has a couple like sort of funky fun options. If you use it without any of the options activated, it will be a regular MS Paint bucket. And then you can add effects to it. So you can cycle through them by clicking this option, and random it's gonna start randomly painting pixels as long as you hold the mouse button. And then you have different ones like sideways. It's gonna try and paint from one side to the other. Growing will paint from the center of the mouse outwards. And then rainbow will ignore the color that you chose and just paint like a rainbow pattern on your image, which I think looks really great. You can combine rainbow with the other effects and then you get kind of different textures. If you hold down shift and click on different buckets, the painting will keep going. So you can use this to have several ones at the same time and make a cool texture. What else? You have your typical color palettes. You can choose different colors. You can so all of the palettes here are editable. So you can pick a new color that you like, and hit the plus button to add it to the color swatches. Or if the color is in your palette, you can hit minus to delete it. And you have a couple buttons for adding a new palette or going to the next one. Onion skin, if you're familiar with an animation tool, it's pretty straightforward. It will draw the next and previous frame and overlay it on top of the frame that you're editing. So you typically want to have this as a reference if you're trying to make excuse me, this ball fall or change shape. I can know where my previous stroke was, and then I can use that as a guide to make it shrink, or I guess this is kind of rotating. Symmetry, it's really fun. It gives you different ways in which you can use symmetry to make it easier for you to draw an interesting image. Horizontal symmetry is really good for faces, characters. Vertical symmetry, sometimes it's good for if you want to make like a landscape that's reflecting water or something like that. Four ways, it's pretty good for things like flower petals, or even just cool abstract patterns or symbols. Playing card is sort of the same as using the playing card preset. You can make a cool diagonal thing. And then flip will do what it says. It just flips the image around. So on top of the canvas, you have the timeline editor where you can see a preview of all your frames. So if we make a little person here, make another frame, we can see the change in the timeline. We can, drag, choose, scrub through both frames. I have playback settings. You can see one frame at a time. You can change the playback mode, which what it's gonna do is by default your animations are gonna loop. But then if you change the playback mode, let's see, you get an interesting one which is called back and forth. And then the animation, instead of looping, it's gonna keep going back and forth. And that's a lot of times that's really useful. You have a speed setting. So in Doodle Studio 95, you usually don't set frames per second, which is common with animation tools. You usually just set the speed. You have 3 different speeds. They're carefully curated, timings for you to make a slow animation, a normal one, and a fast one. So you don't have to think about that. On the right side, you have add frame. We'll add a new keyframe. And this is sort of following if you're familiar with Macromedia Flash back in the day, the idea is that you have frames, sometimes they're called keyframes, which hold a drawing. And then a frame can be longer or shorter. So, for example, if you want to make, a ball that's bouncing around, and you want to make the ball stay in the air a little bit longer, you would do something like this. You would draw it in the air, draw it halfway through, sort of draw it hitting the ground. Maybe it stretches a little bit more. And then we're going to do back and forth. So it starts going up and down, up and down. But we want it to stay in the air a little bit longer. So we're going to make this frame longer, so maybe a couple more frames, right? And then you have duplicate frame. We'll just make a copy of the frame that you're currently at. There's a little bit of a hidden feature here, which is that you can right-click a frame, and it will give you more options. Like you can move it to the right or move it to the left, so it's gonna make this longer frame go after what used to be the second frame. You also have this record function. Basically, what it's gonna do is it's gonna add frames as long as you're holding down the mouse. So you can make a little squiggle with your mouse, and then that's gonna become your animation. When you click record, you can see the border becomes red. That's when record sort of is armed or is enabled. And if I start drawing, you can see that the frames start adding up. And then when I let go, it's gonna keep playing the animation and it's gonna loop. And then the stroke that I made is the animation, right? And the other thing is that at any time, even when the animation is playing, you can keep drawing, so you can keep adding to an animation. For example, here I can just keep adding strokes, and then we're gonna keep adding up. So this is pretty useful. This feature is actually really good for making particles. So for example, if I wanted to make just like a flying little bug, I can just make a stroke like that, and then I can turn it into particles. And I want to have this sort of swarm of bugs. If I set it to, no speed, and then make the camera look at it, you can see that you have this sort of really, really quick swarm animated little flies. Drawing while animating is also really useful if you make a character, for example. Let's make a little face like this. And if I duplicate the frame and hit play, I can just start adding little sweat ants on top of it. So once you have your animation, you can turn it into a lot of different things by using the make button. The make button gives you all these options. You can turn the animation to a sprite, and it's gonna be a shortcut that's gonna load your animation and turn it into a game object in your scene that already has all the right settings, like the a sprite render and this component called Doodle Animator, which is the one that you use to make your animations render on your scene. And it already picked the right animation. So with just one button, you have your animation already in your scene. Then you can make a sprite that's shadow casting. So if you want to make like a sort of like a 2.5D environment, you're not gonna notice much of a change unless you add, you can add a plane. Oh, there you go. So you see that it's casting a shadow if we move the light around. And yeah, as soon as you click on an animation, you're gonna see a preview. So that works well. You can make particles, which is really useful when you make square animations. You can use sorry, I forgot, this checkerboard mode button will basically just change from a light or a dark background with which to preview your animations. So if you're making, if you're using a lot of black strokes, you want a light background. If you're using white to draw, you want a dark background. And if you want to make particles, it's usually a good idea to make them white, because then when they're white, you can change their color using the particle system editor. And the same goes with regular sprite renders. Black strokes, you can, at least using the default shaders that come with Unity, there's not an easy way to change their color. So for example, if I make a little puff of smoke, I'm just gonna make a very simple one. I'm gonna use my bucket to fill it up. Oops. And then so I have this animation. I'm gonna make a loop. You can hit make particles, and then yeah, it will make a particle system with just the default settings. And each particle is gonna play back the animation from start to finish, and then die, and then disappear. And then it's really fun to sort of change the speed and play around with all the particle system effects while using all these hand-drawn animations. And then the last option for turning your sprite into an object is UI. So if you use the UI preset, you get this very cool, like, symmetric layout. And then once you press make and turn it into a UI image, it's gonna add, if it's not there, it's gonna add a canvas for you using the Unity UI system and make an image component with your file in it. And if you're using the UI preset and you already have all these sort of sprite borders laid out for you, when you scale your object, and it will keep the corners scaled. It will keep the right resolution, so you can make animated window frames and stuff like that. For example, if I duplicate the frame and then I hit play, and then I just start drawing on top of it, for example with red, I can make sort of this walking ants pattern. And if I hit save and replace it, then we're gonna have, all of the UI settings are gonna be respected. So that's a really cool way of making animated windows and buttons and stuff like that. The last thing in the window UI is the save button. You can, once, if you're editing an image for the first time and you hit save, it's gonna automatically save a animation file for you, which is our own custom file type. And then if you already saved it before, it's gonna give you more options like replacing, or you can save it as a different animation, or you can save it as a sprite sheet, which is gonna export an actual PNG texture where all the frames are laid out in just like your old regular sprite sheets. And then each frame is gonna be a sprite. So that's pretty handy if you want to turn your animations into something that you want to use in a different software or a different package. And you can also export a GIF file. So that's pretty neat. The other big element in Doodle Studio is the Doodle animator component, where if you have any sort of renderer, like a sprite renderer or a UI image, and you add a Doodle animator component, then you can choose an animation file, right? So you can pick any animation that you made, and basically it will take care of everything for you. So the animation starts playing in your renderer, so you don't have to think about anything. And this applies to, you can use a Doodle animator with particles. You can use it actually with a regular 3D object. So if I have a quad and I add my ostrich, you might need a material that supports transparency, for example, the particles. Maybe this one's looking a little weird. And you can even use animations on 3D objects. So that's an ostrich in a capsule. And then the animator comes with a few options. You can change the speed of the animation. So this is gonna override the original settings of the animation. You can set it to play a random frame when the scene starts. You can set it not to play and then wait for you to play using scripting. And then you have this tick box called override file settings, where you can change kind of like more detailed things about the animation. This is usually if you're looking to have more control. This is how you usually change things around. You can override the playback mode. It gives you a couple more than the ones you get in the window. Namely, once will make the animation only play once and then stop. So if you want to have an animator that's only supposed to play once and then just go away, this is how you would do it. You can manually change the frames per second. So if you want to play it at 80 frames per second, you can do it. You can set it to a single frame. So this is pretty useful if you want to only use one of the frames that you drew as the one that's going to display on the scene. And then you can just scrub to pick the one that you want. And then you have these texture settings, which you can see that it has this warning because you can change things like the filter mode. So for example, this one is set to trilinear. So if you zoom in, you do see the pixels, but they look kind of like smoothed out. So if you wanted to, you know, wanted the pixels to be sharp and your animations happen to be saved in smooth mode, which uses trilinear filtering, then you can change it over here. Or if you have a UI element, right, that you need to change pixels per unity and stuff like that, you can do it here. The one thing is that by overriding the settings, the internal sprites are gonna have to be regenerated when you load the scene. So that means that the loading times are gonna be longer if you have a lot of sprites that have all custom settings here. So the other feature I want to talk about is drawing in the scene view. So as long as you have the Doodle Animator window open and scene view drawing is enabled in the preferences, you're gonna get this quad, which in your hierarchy is gonna show us draw preview, and this is basically just the same as the canvas that you have in the window, except that it's on your scene and you can move it around, so you can scale it up and down. And this lets you, place your drawing in the context of the scene that you already have. So, for example, if I were to open the environment example, I'd be able to, have a scene already. I'd be able to make a drawing that is the right scale for me without having to, worry about scaling it back later. So if I wanted to make, let's say we can make a chair here. I can either draw it here, or I can hit the draw button in the scene view, and what it's gonna do is it's gonna lock the camera controls, so I can't really move the camera around anymore. I can just zoom in and out with the scroll wheel. And then if I click on the square, then I'm gonna be drawing right there. So wait, I was making a chair, right? So I can make a chair like that. It's kind of a funky chair. And then you'll usually want to go back to the main window to draw more details and stuff like that. But it's pretty good for making basic shapes and knowing where your drawing is going to be. So I mentioned the preferences. You can tweak a few of the things of Doodle Studio 95 if you want to by going to the Doodle Studio 95 folder and hitting the preferences file. And then you can choose where your textures are going to be drawn by default. A lot of the settings for each of the presets if you want to change those. The brush sizes. You can manage your color palettes here if you want to sort of like an easier way of handling them. And then you have a couple beta sort of experimental features. Scene view drawing is the one I just showed you. The jumble tool is sort of like a tool that I never really got around to. It didn't quite fit the rest of the tool, but it's still kind of cool, so I sort of left it around as an option. The jumble tool will let you randomly move around pixels where your brush is. So if you click around the edges, you can make kind of like fur effects, or you can sort of make kind of fake gradients and stuff like that. It has this option called jumble a lot that will make the effect a lot stronger, but a little bit more chaotic. Um, and then the sound recorder will give you this option right in the middle of the timeline, where if you make an animation, say I make a little twirl going up, if you hit the record button, the record sound button, you will be able to record a sound using your microphone that will be referenced by the animation file, and it will be played back whenever you have that animation in the scene. So for example, as soon as in this version, as soon as I click the record button, it will play the animation and give me a chance to record the sound. So now it's playing back. Um, and then the last sort of experimental feature is custom brush, where you can give it any texture, and you will use the alpha value as the brush. So, for example, if you want to make sort of smooth lines like this, you can use that brush, or you can use it to make stamps. For example, you can use the little turtle. Um, as the one thing to note is that the brush is gonna be the texture that you choose, as long as there's a texture over here. So if you set a brush and then left the preferences, and then next time you use Doodle Studio, it will still have that brush. So I would try and keep it to none if you want to use the default ones later. So that's Doodle Studio 95, and you can check out the manual if you want to see any more tutorials or details, and you can contact me if you have any problems with it.